Good evening, everybody. My name is Wayne Ranney, and I serve on the board of directors for the Grand Canyon Historical Society. And we welcome you to tonight's virtual outing. The Grand Canyon Historical Society, our mission is to celebrate and promote the study and preservation of the Grand Canyon region's cultural and natural history for the education and enjoyment of its members and the public. And just last year in 2024, we celebrated 40 years of existence when the society was started by some pioneer members of Grand Canyon Village. We encourage you to become a member. Our dues are only $35 a year. We are an all-volunteer organization, and we're hopeful that many of you can join us so that we can continue to expand all of our activities like these virtual outings and in-person outings and our tri-annual history symposiums. If you do become a member, you'll get 4 issues in the calendar year of the Old Pioneer magazine, which has a lot of history articles about the Grand Canyon and the Grand Canyon region. So we do these virtual outings. We conduct tours at the South and North Rim, and you can find it on our website. Our website is very easy, grandcanyonhistory.org.
Wheels it to the top of the canyon, sends it on to a train and into Chicago, where it takes several prizes for specimen heap. So now Cameron, it's clear he's on a path. He's on a path upwards. But with the Spanish-American War and the death of Bucky O'Neill, his ambition for a train line begins to crumble. As we all know, by 1901, the Santa Fe has bought the remaining stock of the original train line and extended it to the canyon. But he's holding an ace, of course, with the Bright Angel Trail. And so he sets up his cabin and his post office and his hotel right at the top of the Bright Angel Trail to control the tourist traffic coming in. Of course, he lets the Kolb set up there. He's got his tents in the background. He's doing all right before the train, not huge, but he's making it. Now, this is a map taken from the 1916 Grand Canyon Working Plan of the canyon at the time, 1916, but it gives you an idea, like specifically this right here, these drawings. These are the mill sites and the load claims that Ralph Cameron had patented over the beginning of the Bright Angel Trail, the Cape Horn lode. Now, Cameron realizes that he's going to be cut out of the financial game of the railroad, but he's still got his mining claims to control access into the canyon. So he begins compiling a group of lawyers who are slick with the mining elements of the territory, and they realize, okay, we can just lay these claims over everything, and while there's gray areas on whether or not the toll road is actually Cameron's or is it Pete Berry's or whose is it, the toll road, the Bright Angel Trail, was the most significant portion of his real estate, but of course there was a lot of gray area as to who actually owned it. However, if you own the mouthpiece and the choke point of the trail with a mining claim, you essentially own the trail. Now, Ralph Cameron also knew the laws, and he knew that in 1901, when the mining consortium of Berry and Cameron's brother and some other folks who had originally built the trail was in Pete Berry's name. In 1901, after 10 years of the trail being in his name, they applied for an extension, 5-year extension, and which was granted by the Secretary of the Interior. They had to go to Washington and argue before Ethan Allen Hitchcock, Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior, that they should actually be able to possess the trail. After some negotiation back and forth, he was able to begin tolling the trail in 1903 and quickly dominated the tourist empire by charging a toll for every a dollar for every horse ridden, driven, or led, or mule, or donkey, or any other stock. So Cameron's lawyers come up with this plan that involves Cameron running for the county commission. Now, they know that after the 15 years a trail is in private ownership, it reverts back to the county in which it lay. So what does Cameron do is he runs for the county commission. And within 3 years, and by 1906, he's the head of the county commission. So as the trail nears its transfer date, you've got Cameron waiting to transfer it, and the new district attorney, Henry Fountain Ashurst, saying, whoa, we're seeing what's going on here. We don't like it. This is some backdoor dealing, and this is probably illegal. So you got Ashurst calling bluff, Cameron pushing his agenda. And on the day that the trail is supposed to transfer, Ralph Cameron, who at this point had consolidated his ownership, at least in theory, into his own unit. He had bought out his partners, and now it was his trail to own and to make a call. So as a citizen, he relinquishes his rights to the county. Then as the county commissioner, he takes those rights and says, okay, now it's county property. We can either keep letting it be used privately, or we can make it a county fund and continue charging a toll. So what does he do? Of course, he keeps the toll, but he contracts with L.L. Farrell, his friend, brother-in-law, and business partner. And Farrell takes that, becomes the county custodian of the trail. And the contract itself, if you read it, which is posted throughout Coconino Sun, it just reeks of cronyism. Farrell has zero liability for anything that may happen on the trail. He is allowed to keep 100% of the proceeds collected on the trail. No doubt that was being funneled back into Cameron's personal pocket. So long as Farrell maintained it, took the tolls, it was pretty much a carte blanche business arrangement. So while this is happening, Cameron's lawyers are again scheming a new tactic. So now that it's county possession, and the territorial laws say that it's county possession, their new goal is to introduce a bill into the territorial legislature that will revert a county's right and give them the ability to return a trail to its previous owner. Now, if you look at the bill, it's written in a way that makes it seem like toll roads are everywhere in Arizona in 1905, 1906. However, if you look at the tax records of the state, there is one toll road in the entire territory, and it's the Bright Angel Trail. So after some back and forth and some Washington influence, the territorial legislation overrides a veto from Governor Kibbe saying to cancel the bill. The bill passes. Coconino County is then given permission to return the trail to Ralph Cameron, which it does immediately. Now, there's the Santa Fe at one point had offered to take responsibility of the trail, giving over 75% of the toll to the county. However, in the new bill, Cameron was only required to give 10% to the state education or the county educational fund. So, and just a wicked form of just the most devilish ways, he was able to say, no, I'm giving money to the education of the children through this fund. Look how great I am. So he knows what he's doing. Ralph Cameron is shrewd. He knows that his name is in the newspapers every day, that his fight with the Bright Angel Trail and the Santa Fe is getting more and more popular. He is fostering this Robin Hood sense of victimhood that is pitting him and the local people against the mighty titan of industry, the Santa Fe. So as you might think, that leads to a popularity that only is good for politicking. So now you've got Cameron. He's been the sheriff. He's been the county commissioner. He sees his eye on Congress. Now, at this point, it's about 1908. Roosevelt had established Grand Canyon National Monument, which removes all unpatented and claims from, or unstaked claims from the Grand Canyon. So no further mining development. Ralph Cameron lives on the mining claims. That's his whole bread and butter. And while tourism is proving to be a nice little slice for the Bright Angel Trail, Ralph Cameron's real interest for controlling the trail is not for the tourist industry. It's for his ambition to dam the Colorado River and build a hydroelectric plant to pump energy into his mining operation. And the best way to do that is the person who controls the only access at the train depot controls the water. And Cameron knows this. And so what he does is he stakes claims, an Indian Garden as well, patenting the whole area. He, of course, lays his camp up there. And the camp here in these photos is very well kept, very clean, very new looking. And just remember these photos later as the story progresses. It's well kept. You know, this stone building in every photo I've ever seen never has a roof, so I'm wondering what actually happened to that. But again, here is Cameron's whole scheme. You can see he's drawn mining claims, both mill sites and lode claims, over each other. Now look at this one in particular. This is a willow site and is underneath an existing claim right there. So you can see how convoluted his whole system was, that by linking claim after claim and site after site, he is literally implanting his mineral rights over the only location that the trail can go. So he's claiming ownership of the trail as a toll road. Now he's doubling down by occupying every morsel of space with mining claims. And more particularly is these claims have the spring heads on them. And so he's controlling literally the source of water at Indian Gardens. And now, but his plan, again, is to dam the Colorado River. And so he's got to have the only trail leading into it. And beginning in the early 1900s, he begins to seek outside investment to dam it. And he's using his shrewd business tactics to say, I've got the money, I've assayed this area, it's proving high in gold, I've got the property, transportation, it's all here, all I need is your money to build this dam. Now, if you can think about it too, mines were being worked by mules and donkeys and horses. And it quickly hits a ceiling of what can be produced and extracted. However, if you have a tram, if you have electric hoists and winches and jackhammers and lights, suddenly you go from a dog and pony show to a full-scale production facility. And his plan was to have put the dam right at the end of the Bright Angel Trail, which many of y'all can envision that sandy beach right there near that area where the rocks are narrow, and of course it'd be a good choke point. So if Cameron had his way beginning in the early 1900s, much of that area as we know it would be underwater. And so to do this, Ralph Cameron realizes he needs more influence. So in 1908, he begins to run for the Territorial Congress. And if you look at these photos, I think that's really telling of Cameron as a man. And if you consider these photos as early promotional pieces for himself, you see the photo on the left, he is on the trail. He's galvanizing his connection to the social idea of him and the trail. And then on the photo on the right, he's in a mine shaft. And he's laying his hand possessingly over the mine shaft. And so he's ingraining in people's minds that he's connected to the Grand Canyon, mines, and the trail, and that's what he needs to be remembered by. And you can tell that these are, he's done up a little bit. Sure, everyone looked nice back in the day, but look at the way that his hat is tilted backwards. That's almost a sure suggestion from one of the Cole brothers that took it to say, hey, let's let people really see your face, tilt your hat back so we can see it. And then again, it's like he's promoting the idea of a politician, so he's working towards that image. Of course, he does get elected, and he wins off of what I think, and I'm beginning to have the evidence point towards a significant influence by Teddy Roosevelt himself. There are multiple times in which Ralph Cameron travels to Washington to speak directly to Teddy Roosevelt and Ethan Allen Hitchcock regarding his Grand Canyon claims and his rights there. He is, of course, mutual friends with Bucky O'Neill, and they're both Republicans. And in a letter to Edward Kent, Roosevelt actually expresses how delighted he is that Cameron wins the delegation, and specifically says that he will encourage the idea of independent statehood at his next meeting. And at the time, the consideration of New Mexico and Arizona entering the Union as a single state was highly contested. There was no doubt that the two territories would enter. However, whether they were independent or together was left to be decided. Ralph Cameron was staunchly in the independent category and had, in fact, campaigned on his promise to achieve statehood for Arizona. And you can see by these headlines just, exactly what does the press think of Cameron? He's promoting this kind of like, I came from nothing and look at me now kind of fighter and ambition. He's got the moral drive of a sheriff. He's got the political experience of a commissioner. He's got the practical experience of a miner and just an everyday guy. And so he really does win favor throughout Arizona and is elected. And he goes on. Of course, Roosevelt is out, but Taft is in. And they begin working extensively towards the promotion of Arizona as a state. And so eventually, in 1912, with much back and forth between the parties, they do sign the statehood, and this is Cameron to the left, or to the right, excuse me, of Taft. Cameron actually had a eagle feather quill dipped in gold, made specifically for the event. Eagle, both, of course, coming from Arizona. So Taft signed it with a feather from Arizona and a feather from New Mexico. So now Arizona is a part of the Union, which means that it's also part of the federal bank. So Cameron, of course, is pushing for new federal businesses or buildings to be built throughout Arizona, new post office, prisons, but mostly new irrigation. So at one point, Cameron was even promoting the idea of digging a canal from the Gulf of California into Arizona to create it and make it a seafaring state, which is pretty wild to imagine that Arizona could be a seafaring state. But that was one of Cameron's big ambitions at the time, as well as new ditches, new irrigation systems, new dams along the Salt River, which ultimately led to the prosperity of Phoenix. And so Cameron's doing all these things publicly, and he's making a big splash, and people are really liking him. Behind the scenes is not so much. He hasn't paid his lawyers in years. These are the same lawyers that figured out every loophole so that he could control his empire at the canyon, which at this point has grown to thousands of acres. We're talking dozens of mining claims spread all across the area, and it's all because of Cameron's lawyers. Now, I should give a backstory at some point to give a context just how sleazy Ralph Cameron is. When he was a commissioner, the one of his lawyers who he had achieved was Clark, the same guy who had gotten Charles Green out of his con artist scheme. He hadn't paid Clark. Clark was hounding him for money. So what Cameron does is he forces Henry Ashurst to take Clark on as a partner. This is the commissioner forcing the DA to hire on an additional support. And what Cameron did was then use county funds to pay Clark's business expenses. Clark, of course, did nothing, but through the books, it went from the county to Clark. Excuse me. And that ended the indebtedness of Cameron to Clark. Cameron also would do things he tried to pay one of his lawyers off with some mining claims. And these are the same claims that the same lawyer said, hey, we should essentially fake these claims so that we can control the area. And so it's amazing when you look at these letters through to Cameron and his lawyers, just the level of confidence that people give to Cameron. You know, he was a glad hander and he had a disarming smile and he could talk his way into anything. And so to think that you've got the same lawyers who are giving him advice on how to cheat the system, but he's somehow convincing them to bite that same apple, it really does make you think that he's just a terrific politician. And no doubt that he's standing next to the president, making one of the most monumental legislations in state history. However, he's doing it all, again, for his personal benefit. Now, about the same time this photo was taken, the Santa Fe Railroad was sick of trying to push him out over the Bright Angel Trail. So they began building Hermit's Trail 8 miles to the east. Cameron hears of this and rushes to lay claim over several sections of the road being built out to Hermit's Rest, as well as major creek crossings and along the Bright Angel or the Hermit's Trail and the proposed campsites. So again, he's cutting the Santa Fe out by just rushing in, laying claim. And his whole means of this laying claim issue, it's a pretty simple one if you think about it. The law states that a miner can stake a claim, a placer claim, a load claim, a mill site. He can stake a claim, and so long as he does the $100 a year of upkeep, he can keep it, but there's never any reason to patent it. Now, once you patent it, you have to have show proof of viable ore and a payable load, and you've got to be able to really invest in it. But if you just do the minimal upkeep, you're essentially a long-term leasee, and you can use it as you please. And that's how Cameron was able to claim everything. Is he never proved that he had anything. He just said it was there. And by saying it was there, it was enough. And doing the basic amount of upkeep, it was enough. And so Cameron is, he's getting big in Washington, but at the same time, he's fighting his fight back at the Grand Canyon. And he's doing pretty good. He's holding the Santa Fe at bay much better than anyone else expected. And then after he becomes a governor, after Congress, he runs for governor. And during this time, he's invested with a fella named Frank Dobler. And Dobler is a big Eastern Capital fella who Cameron has convinced to begin investing in his hydroelectric power plant. Because at this point, Cameron he's got everything he needs except for money to begin building his power plant. Cameron, he swoons Dobler and his friends. They're all in. They like it. And it wasn't long at all before they develop a company with Cameron as the president. And immediately Cameron starts asking for advances on his pay from Dobler and his other investor friends. And we're talking like quickly, he's asking for $1,500, $2,000. He can't pay the hotel bill, so he's wiring them immediate need. He can't pay for breakfast, so he's saying, "Hey guys, I'm really up against the wall here. I need some support." So you think about the type of person he's running for governor, but he's so indebted that he can't buy his own breakfast or pay for his hotel bill. And so is he just so dependent that on using other people's money that he has none of his own? Or is he so clever that he never uses his own money? It's something I haven't figured out about Ralph Cameron. Cameron is running for governor, and he's quoted as saying to Dobler and his investors, "I think I have a good chance for success, and it will mean something for us to have the governor of the state with us," meaning the power plant. So his whole ambition for running for governor is so that he could be in that better position to dam the Colorado River and be the one who pushes that forward. And so, of course, Cameron doesn't win, and so he's kind of put on the back burner of the dam project. He's still using Dobler though as a means to grift and grind. And the Santa Fe this is circa 1915 at this point. They're still very much interested in getting Ralph Cameron out of the Bright Angel Trail and its influence. A little bit of context: the trail had reverted back to the county by this point. However, Cameron's mining claims that were superimposed over the trail, Cameron still claims to possess. So Dobler and Cameron, they're tied on cash, right? They need money for this project. So Dobler comes up with the idea, let's sell some mining claims to the Santa Fe, get them off our back, we'll get some quick cash, and we'll just move on, call it a loss, whatever. So they begin this secret negotiation. The Santa Fe does not want anyone knowing that they're going through the process of buying out this guy who's just been a sore thumb to them for more than a decade now. It would look pretty poorly if word got out to the Santa Fe's competitors that they were making deals with guys like Cameron. So they negotiate this back and forth, and they figure, okay, we'll give you, I think that the cost was $16,000. And they said, we'll give you some of it up front, and we'll give you the rest when the deal is done. And in the meantime, Cameron transfers his claims to Dobler so that there's a smoke screen so that the Santa Fe doesn't, appear too weak. So Dobler's got these claims, but Cameron is the secondary on it. And so at this point, World War II is ramping up, World War I is ramping up. Money's becoming tighter. Dobler is beginning to bow out of the situation. He's not bowing out necessarily, but he just can't put up as much money. So Cameron, again, knowing the mining laws, realizes, okay, Dobler hasn't paid me for these claims for a while, even though Santa Fe is supposed to be claiming them. They still haven't finalized the deal, so it's only that initial payment that's been made. Dobler hasn't been making these payments to me, which means that I can default on him. And so when I do that, I get all these claims back. They become mine again. So the law says you have to publish this in a newspaper to make it a public knowledge. So Cameron goes to the Las Vegas Times, some weekly little newspaper in Las Vegas, publishes that he's defaulting on Dobler, knowing full well this guy's never going to see that he's being defaulted on. He covers his bases and he takes the claims back. He says, screw it on taking the remainder of the Santa Fe money, and boom, Ralph Cameron is now in possession of everything he had just lost. And in fact, just made a quick couple of $1,000 on. So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with Ralph Cameron. And then re-enter the picture this fella, George Henry Stetson. Now, Stetson had come out and met Cameron back in the late 1800s when Stetson's father, the very John Stetson, whose hat empire helped settle the West, the Stetsons came out to be tourists at Grand Canyon. And what better tour guide than the mining entrepreneur and sheriff of Ralph Cameron? So Cameron had met the Stetson years ago and had apparently kept in contact with the younger George Henry Stetson. So now that this Stetson is a young, older man, this is circa 1917, 18 at this point, he's back in contact with the charming and charisma Ralph Cameron. And the two of them come up with a scheme that's going to galvanize Cameron's ownership of the canyon, make them $1 trillion and still get that dam at the bottom of Bright Angel Trail. And so they see the writing on the wall. It's 1917, 1918. People are vying for the idea of the Grand Canyon becoming a national park. The Park Service has just been established. People want the canyon as a park. It's already been protected as a monument, a forest reserve, a game preserve. It has all these statuses, but it's not a national park. Why? Because men like Ralph Cameron are pushing feverishly to keep it from it. But the writing's on the wall. It's going to be a park. So what does Cameron do? He, along with Stetson, creates the United States Platinum Company and claims that there is a huge platinum bonanza occurring on the Tonto Plateau near Indian Gardens. And oh, wouldn't you know it, they just happen to have all the claims already there. Now, at the time, platinum was a hugely expensive mineral. There were no major bonanzas or strikes in the United States. And so this was big news. Furthermore, it was the opportunity to galvanize Cameron's claims. He could go from a claim to a patent. And once it was a patent, it was his. And the government couldn't tell him what to do. No one could tell him what to do. It was his. Fee simple. So Cameron and Stetson create this appearance that there's this bonanza there. They send some product off to some assayers. The assayers say, wow, this is fantastic. I want to come see this. I'd be willing to invest if this is real. So they're like, yeah, let's do it. So they create the United States Platinum Company. They start selling bonds. They start promoting themselves all across the country. And it's a big thing. And you've got all these investors saying, I'm ready to dump a lot of money in there. But I want a little more into this. I want another assay. I want another assurance before I sink all this money into building a dam, creating a hydro plant, stringing wires, cables, trams, all this major infrastructure that would go into making a productive platinum mine. So they want a little more. And at this point, so does the government. And so there's this young fella that's sent in, Ross Corbin. Corbin is a new assayer in the game. And he's been sent from all reasons that I could point to, someone in the federal government to expose Cameron, because the park really wants to make it a park. Park Service wants to make it a park. Federal government, Department of Interior wants him out. They need to push Cameron out, where they can only do that by proving that these claims are fake. And everyone's known that he's been a BSer on these claims since they've been doing it. But he's been able to just pull stuff off. It's incredible. It's incredible how he does it. It really is. But with Corbin, he's a man on the ground. So he's sent in, and as he's riding his mule down the Bright Angel Trail, he passes the Kolb studio, and he recalls a lecture that his professor told him that platinum mines can be salted by burning photographic materials and then isolating tiny bits of platinum that exist in the photographic material and then introducing those into a sample. So now Corbin's like, whoa, this could be what's happening. But he knows that he can't, give up this insight that he's suddenly developed. So he keeps his cool, and he goes down to Indian Gardens on his mule and his pack animal. He's met by a representative of the United States Platinum Company, who immediately hands him a dozen bags of ore. Corbin says, great, thanks. I'll test these out, but I'm also going to get some more and just see what's around. So Corbin tests the 12 bags of platinum, or that he had been given by the representative. Of course, as he suspected, they all tested positive for platinum. But then he tests various other samples throughout the area, and unsurprisingly, none of them appear to have platinum in it. So Corbin's ears are raised pretty big at this point. So he's thinking, okay, this is my plan. I'm going to shuffle these bags back into the box so that it looks like a random organization. But I know what the order is, Bag 2 is going to be bag next to bag 7, next to bag 11, But in my mind, I know exactly where these are. I'm going to fold my gloves neatly on top. So he packs up. He says, "Great, thanks. Everything looks good." And takes off, heads up to the canyon, gets on a train, leaves the ore at the depot, heads back east. A week later, when the ore arrives back at his laboratory, he cracks it open, and just as he suspected, the bags have been rearranged, the gloves have been moved around, and every bag of ore now showed positive for high-grade platinum. So, exposing this, Cameron and Stetson are deemed, blue sky con artists by the mining industry. They're lambasted as being frauds, and they're, more importantly, the General Land Office now has the proof to say your claims are invalid. So after a long time, now you've got a major federal organization saying you are no longer able to be here. But Ralph Cameron's a pretty hubris dude, and he doesn't like that. So he's pushing his agenda still, and he pushes his agenda through the court system. And in 1920, he pushes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court hears a case of the mining claims. Now, up until this point, no court case had ever challenged the Antiquities Act. Signed, of course, in 1906. Now, 14 years later, in 1920, the act is being challenged for the first time in the Supreme Court because Ralph Cameron, his sole defense is that the Grand Canyon is not an area of scientific interest, and it should not be a national monument based on the existing criteria. However, the justices don't see it that way. And the justices affirm the vagueness of what exactly the smallest area deemable, or whatever the exact quote is, means to a president. So they leave the door wide open for a president's interpretation. And they also leave the door wide open for what is deemed a scientific interest. So now you've got the opportunity for a grassland in Nebraska or a shoal in Louisiana to be considered a scientific interest. And boom, you've got enough for a president to say this is a national monument. And so that decision has become a landmark case in public land policy. And without that case, the ability for a president to establish national monuments would have a tremendously drastic different course of history. And it was all a result of Cameron pushing it, saying that the act itself isn't real. So the Supreme Court hears it, and they side against Ralph Cameron. They said, your claims are fake. Not only that, here's X, Y, and Z that the president can now perform based on the Antiquities Act since you opened that box. And so see you later. But again, Ralph Cameron was by no means done. On the same day that he was getting told that his Supreme Court case was cited against him, Ralph Cameron announced his candidacy for the United States Senate. And of course, Cameron needed money. And so we've got this guy, Henry Stetson, pumping large amounts of dark money into his campaign. And we're talking everything from promotional materials to business expenses, travel expenses, dinners. Cameron has to play the role of the little guy. He has to play the role of the victim. And so he can't be seen hobnobbing with these events, but he still needs money. So he's got Stetson covering all his bills. And so, of course, Stetson and him had just been ousted from the canyon, but they were still business partners. They still had this idea of damming the Colorado River in mind. And you got to consider, too, at this point, the Colorado River Compact was on its way in. People were talking a lot about hydroelectric power. They were talking a lot about the menace of the Colorado River They were talking a lot about expanding Western communities based on irrigation and cheap electric power. So damming the river was on a lot of people's minds. And so Cameron, it had been his ambition for nearly 20 years at this point to dam the river, felt like he was the best guy to do it. And as a United States senator, which he was, of course, elected, he knew that he was in even a better position to make that happen. Cameron was on the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Veteran Affairs, and Irrigation, all really good commissions for him to push his agenda. Now, he ran again on the promise of bringing water to Arizona, and he needed to succeed in that. So he was successful in securing funding for the San Carlos Dam. That dam ultimately led to the forced relocation of some Apache that were brought off so that the dam could be built and flooded. Cameron, no doubt, cared little of that. They could not vote at the time anyway, so I'm sure Cameron had little remorse in forcing a tribe off of their sovereign land so that they could build a dam so that he could gain political points for his constituents. But he was very successful in bringing water projects throughout Arizona. We're talking dams, canals, ditches. So he did succeed in that, and he succeeded in bringing a lot of federal money to Arizona. He definitely represents the classic, I hate the big government until I need a bunch of money from them, and then let's go. He was definitely that guy. I found this recently, and I just thought it was so indicative of Ralph Cameron's personality. This is a advertisement that Ralph Cameron endorsed for Lucky Strike cigarettes. It says, "Where you meet Senator Cameron and talk about smoking, he'd say to you, public speaking taxes the voice. One must think of the throat. I find in smoking that Lucky Strikes not only give me greater enjoyment, but protect the throat." So it's like, oh, Ralph Cameron, what a sleazeball, come on. But Ralph Cameron, he's doing all this stuff, but he's still got that evil, vindictive streak. He was pushed out of the canyon, and god damn if he's going to let the National Park Service roll over him and take his land. So Cameron creates a subcommittee on public lands investigating the national park's expenditures through the last, since it was created, really. And specifically, he's focusing laser in on Stephen Mather. He hates Stephen Mather. The two are feuding nonstop. In fact, Cameron is able to eliminate the Grand Canyon's entire budget for a year. It was later brought back and amended to be significantly reduced, but it just tells you, how threatened public land and how fragile it was in 1922, that a national park's budget could be entirely eliminated through the Senate's budget. Tells you how fragile the idea of a national park was, but it also tells you how vindictive Ralph Cameron was, that he would eliminate that funding. You can draw funding correlation to safety methods and protocols. During this time, that same period is when Reese Griffith was killed on the South Kaibab Trail, or not yet the South Kaibab Trail, but he was killed there. And so it could be argued that Ralph Cameron's denial of funds potentially could have led to lack of safety equipment needed for Reese Griffiths. A bit of a long shot, but it goes to show how the personal level of what it takes to remove funding. But he hated Cameron, or he hated Mather and everything that he stood for. He felt that the national parks were giving money to the railroads so they could bring people in, and it would just be an exclusive monopoly. He was not wrong necessarily in that. However, the level of control that Cameron had for the National Park Services is quite noteworthy. So at the same time, the National Park Service is still pushing for the Bright Angel Trail to be part of their empire, part of their domain. And they begin negotiating with Coconino County to purchase the trail from the county. And in a secret meeting in the Elsevier one evening with Congressman Carl Hayden, Senator Henry Ashurst, county commissioners, and various bigwigs of that ilk, they established that they would sell the Bright Angel Trail to the National Park Service for the sum of $100,000, or essentially the cost of building a new road into the national park. So at the time, this is early 1920s, you got a lot of DIY campers coming into the park and a lot fewer rail cars or train passengers coming in. So the road to the national park was in shambles. If you could even get through it, it took hours. It was rutted out. When it was wet, it was dang near impassable. But you've got thousands of people flooding to the canyon in their automobiles. So the park needs a new road. They need something that's going to allow easy transportation. So the county says, okay, well, we've got this trail that's making $5,000 a year, and it has been forever because there's not going to be more people riding a mule into the canyon. It hit a ceiling years ago because the Fred Harvey mule operation only has so many mules in it, and you're just not going to go over that. So for years, it had been capped at around $5,000 a year in revenue for the county. So they're like, sweet, we'll take a new road, we'll get all this extra tax money, it'll be great. But Ralph Cameron hears about this and says it is illegal for county commissioners to sell county property without first allowing the citizens to vote on the sale. So what they do is they start, there's a for the sale contingency and a against sale contingency, mostly in the two newspapers, the Williams News and the Coconino Sun. And so they're listing all these reasons back and forth, why they should sell, why they shouldn't sell. And people are calling names and people are saying it's government interference and blah blah blah. Get those filthy feds out of our lands. We don't want them, but we'll take that new highway they're building 4 miles away, but not this one. So it gets pretty hot. Ultimately, the vote comes down. The citizens reject the Park Service's appeal for sale, and so the sale doesn't go through. However, in the congressional bill, it stipulated that the money could then be allocated for a new trail. So immediately after the vote is voted against for the sale of the trail of Bright Angel, the National Park Service starts building the South Kaibab Trail. And the South Kaibab Trail, just like the Hermit's Trail, is 100% a means to economically undercut the Bright Angel Trail. Neither the Kaibab nor the Hermit's Trail would exist if the Bright Angel Trail had been a free trail from the get-go. But if you're able to devalue the trail to the extent that it becomes a burden to the county voters will eventually see that it's worthless to maintain it and will take the money for the trail or for the new road, which is exactly what they did a couple of years later. But it did force the hand of the government to build the South Kaibab Trail. Now, Cameron, he's losing the battle with the Bright Angel Trail, but at this point, he's kind of over it. He'd given the Inner Canyon a good 20 years. His minds hadn't really shaked out. He was forced out with the Supreme Court. General Land Office had said no go. And so he starts letting his mind drift downriver. And again, the Colorado River Compact had happened. The dams were going to come. The USGS had just surveyed dozens of sites along the river. And as a senator from Arizona, he had specific insights as to where the dams were going to be. So what does Cameron do? He, along with Stetson, rushed to claim 25 miles of riverbank along the future sites of Hoover Dam and Bullhead Dam. And so what they do is on either side of the river, they lay placer claims, one abutting the other. Then they lay load claims on top of those, one next to the other, along 25 miles of the river continuously. And so what that does is that just muddies the water tremendously. Now, their whole plan now is to say, okay, the dams are going to be here. If we are the possessors of the property, we will be in a much better position to build our own dam. And they were shooting for their own dam. They, in fact, contracted with Army General George Washington Goethals, the fellow who oversaw the construction of the Panama Canal. Together, they came up with an idea for a 1,200-foot rock-filled dam at Boulder Canyon Dam. To give you context, Hoover Dam is less than 1,000 feet. So if you can imagine a 1,200-foot rock-filled dam where Boulder or Hoover Dam is now, that was what their ambition was. And so, in congressional testimony with the Power Commission folks for Congress, William Mulholland is interviewed and says that whenever he went to the sites to begin exploring the possibility, that Cameron and Stetson had already had guys there long before, staking claims, making bores, samples, testing possible locations for exact site. And so, you think about, you've got someone as infamous as William Mulholland, the water czar of California, and he's walking along the same banks as Ralph Cameron and Henry Stetson for the same reason: water, damming the river, and controlling the future of the American West by water. So Cameron's scheme is that they say that there's $64 million worth of potential gold and platinum on these claims. So they've got a pretty clever idea. They're claiming this land so that whenever it comes time to go to investors, they can go to them and say, hey, we've already got this, so come on in. B, they say, if we can't get our dam contract and someone else gets our dam contract, we are required to be reimbursed for the $64 million of lost revenue that we buried. So, and if nothing else, they will have muddied the waters so just entirely that any short-term progress on dam building would take years to sift through, of just the litigation of checking all the mines. And so they've really wrapped their heads around how to control the water and how to control their ability to keep it and keep the prospects of selling the water and the potential power that comes along with it. So Cameron and Stetson, they're before the Senate and the Congress all the time, interviewing, saying, hey, this is our plan. They were going through the right channels. They were doing it. They had Goethals as their contract engineer. And so Cameron's election drew closer, more questions started getting asked about his role and his intent on why he wanted the water so bad. Now, Cameron was he wanted to control the water, but for Arizona. The Colorado River Compact was saying, and the Swing-Johnson bill, which was promoting the idea of Boulder Canyon Dam, really gave Arizona a short shaft on what water allocations they would actually get. And so California was taking a lot of it, and truthfully, no one in Arizona liked the Swing-Johnson bill as it stood. And so Cameron, in his second to last year, filibustered the bill. He killed it independently, along with Ashurst. Henry Ashurst at this point had become a U.S. Senator as well, the former adversary of Cameron back in the Coconino County days. Now they're teammates for Arizona. They had both killed the Swing-Johnson bill in 1926. But then, again, as the election came closer, more questions started getting asked. And A 6-part expose in the Los Angeles Times answered a lot of those questions for some pretty curious folks. In that expose, the author, William Irving, exposed Cameron's decades-long career of deceit, manipulation, extortion. He exposed how, as senator, Cameron had filled certain roles of government offices with his sycophants, and how he was now using them to play out his scheme. For instance, when Cameron's 25 miles of mining claim were called into question, they were brought before the general land, or the territory state land agency officer, who at that point was none other than our good friend L.L. Farrell, the same guy who Cameron had given complete control of the Bright Angel Trail to all those years before. Cameron had now made his brother-in-law the land officer. So when the case came before him, Cameron, as planned, did not appear. And only the federal government's case was presented, exposing the mines as questionable. Using that equation, Farrell then said, well, seeing as how Cameron and Stetson have done all this work to it already, and seeing it as how only one side of the argument was presented, i.e. the federal government side, I cannot side against Cameron and must allow him to continue. So this is the kind of stuff he's playing out, are these tactics. Of course, that was later overruled by by the federal land officer. But Cameron is using his power and his influence to put these people in a role that will, if nothing else, cushion his reality of being a con artist. He's surrounding himself by yes men. Now, of course, Stetson is behind it all, funneling money into him. Stetson is pretty into the idea of the dam, and he knows that Cameron is his man to do it. And so, with the waning hours of the year, Cameron again is at the filibuster platform speaking against the Swing Johnson bill, just talking about nothing, just completely wasting time. And that was wasting time was one of Cameron's ultimate success stories of his entire career. The way he was able to push things back and get things canceled and get things forgotten about was a linchpin in his success. Every time that he would have a court case come up, he would appeal it the day before it was supposed to go. And then once that came up, that appeal date came up, he would appeal that. He would draw it out. He would say, I'm not ready. Give me more time. Oh, I don't have the case ready. We'll need some extra time. So he kept pushing it back. And for years, he would hold things back. And so a filibuster is just a perfect example of how Cameron utilized time to his benefit. Now, Cameron, like all con artists, whenever the light gets shown on them, it seems like they want to reflect it in any other way but themselves. And so as the 1926 campaign is winding to a close, Cameron insisted that there was a slush fund being sent against him from outside influences to promote Carl Hayden, his opponent, into victory. So Cameron just lambasts anyone he can, saying, these guys are out to get me. There's illegal funding happening against me. This is the same guy who had a perjury case against him initially into his Senate experience, because it was exposed of how much dark money Stetson had provided over the years. But now he's saying that the dark money was against him. And so, and just the last minutes, days of the campaign, he forces a Senate inquiry to come together in Phoenix. And so all this stuff starts coming out. They're interviewing postmasters who are saying that Cameron used his role, when he gave them that with the expectation that they would support him and that they would promote him and they would share materials with him. And so you got these guys saying like, yeah, Cameron, he was, very much quid pro quo for sure. So, and then as it comes out more and more, now you've got his campaign financier saying, well, we spent 500, and then he gets pressed and like, well, maybe we spent a couple bucks more, and then, maybe we spent a little bit, maybe a little bit more. But when it finally came out what he had actually spent on the election, it was thousands of dollars more than what he had officially said he had spent. And this is in the books. This is his accountant's books saying these things. It's not some, sneaky reporter trying to get you a gotcha moment. It was his own accountant's books saying that he had exceeded greatly what he was telling the public. And so this is literally happening on the night of the election. So the night of the election, Cameron just does a mad rush of printing of all these propaganda flyers and just distributes them all over Phoenix. Just last ditch hope to get it out. Of course, Cameron loses that election that night, and with it, he loses all hope of getting his dam. However, he is not done, because his last act as a senator, his very last act, last time he spoke on the floor, was another filibuster that killed the Hoover Dam project for that year. And so if it wasn't for Ralph Cameron, the Hoover Dam would have been built years before. The Colorado River would have been dammed right at the mouth of the Bright Angel Creek, and Western water rights and public lands as we know it would have a drastically different course. Now you think, wow, Ralph Cameron, what a hell of a guy. And based on this last sentence of his tombstone, Arizona can never forget him. You'd probably agree. But I challenge y'all to look at the popular and contemporary information about Ralph Cameron, which is surprisingly little, and say, is this the same story that I've been told for the last whoever knows how long? Or is there more to Ralph Cameron than what we actually know? And should we know more? So with that, guys, I'd like to say thanks a lot. I appreciate it. And please let me know if you have any questions.
That is just amazing, Harris.
Wow.
I'm just stunned, not knowing that much about Cameron, but wow. So those of you that have questions, please drop those in the chats. And I'm gonna start with a couple questions here. So Cameron blocks appropriations for the Park Service.
Correct.
Did he need some legislation to do that? How did he stop that?
Yeah. So he spoke against it and convinced enough senators to vote against it. And then it went back to Congress and they renegotiated the bill. They represented it back to the Senate and they agreed on a new budget, but it was significantly reduced.
And so this would be a yearly appropriation bill. So the next year it would be a fight again.
It would be a fight again. From everything I can tell, he was only able to succeed once, maybe twice in doing that before.
Okay, so another question I've got, he's got this ambition. He wants to build Hoover Dam. He wants to be the dam guy. And his fallback is he's got the land where the dam needs to be built. So how did the Bureau of Reclamation get around his mining claims?
By invalidating him. They, everyone knew that what they were, and that's why he laid several types on top of each other.
Got it.
So that it would take, because you have to invalidate every single claim.
Oh, wow.
And so every single claim also has a couple of other ones on top of it. Then you've just got a bureaucratic nightmare.
25 miles, both sides of the river, multiple claims on one on top of the other. That's a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah. And, no claim was actually in Cameron's name. And that's how he was able to distance himself and say, I don't own anything on the
Right.
Colorado River anymore. They were all in Stetson's name. Some people who didn't know that their names was on the list. Cameron's brother, his son, his mom, anyone but Cameron,
Hmm.
so that he could say he was clear.
Wow.
That's amazing. And let me make sure I get this trail business right. So the Santa Fe goes out to put in the Hermit Trail, but I thought Louis Boucher had put that trail in. Did the
Yeah.
Santa Fe just boost it up, just widen it up and clean it
They,
up?
made it better. They made it better. They put their tourist camp there at Hermit Camp, connected it to the Tonto, made it more of a mule trail. So when you say they built it, they expanded on it, made it better. But they made it what we know.
Okay. So in theory, if Cameron hadn't had control of the Bright Angel, then the Santa Fe probably would have done the Hermit Camp at Indian Gardens.
Correct. And the Indian Gardens thing is, I meant to get back to that. That's later, and whenever the National Park Service and the federal government are trying to push him out, they use the Indian Gardens as the main tool to get the public to hate Ralph Cameron, because Cameron is he's controlling the waterheads, so only his innkeeper, his people can get the fresh water. Everything downstream has been contaminated with typhoid based on horse droppings, manure droppings, mule droppings. The tents that you saw earlier, those nice white tents, are just threadbare, thrashed, nothing. The outhouses are overflowing. There's this really great quote from a congressman essentially saying something to the effect of how it disgraced women whose ability to contain nature prohibited their use of the outhouses or something. It just, nature calls and you're not going to go in a skanky outhouse. But everyone thought it was the National Park Services. That's what it was. And so they're seeing this stuff and say, what are you guys doing?
Right.
Like,
Wow.
what the hell? And they're like, hey, it's not our fault. The Santa Fe at a couple of times tried to clean it up and, haul out all the stuff, but Cameron forced them out.
So the Santa Fe concept is we're gonna go to Hermit's Rest. The Park Service's concept is, all right, you guys take him out over there to the west. We're gonna take him out to the east with the Kaibab Trail, to basically try to knock him out. But he's sitting at the head of the train tracks.
Right. Which is still the thing. It's like the Bright Angel is still the most popular trail just because of the convenience of everything.
Yeah. So the last question I've got for you before there's a couple questions up here. You mentioned the film in platinum, and there is some very fascinating history with that. Were you able to link Cameron to going to the Kolbs and asking them for used film or dead film?
Not directly. Yeah, but you also got to think that Cameron wasn't on site at a lot of these things. He had proxies and associates and helpers and caretakers and stuff. You got to think he's directed. Whether or not the Kolbs are implicated in a salting fraud is something that it places them there. But who knows? The guy could have stolen some film from the studio.
Getting film is pretty easy, so you wouldn't necessarily need to implicate the Kolbs, but it would be curious if there was. So Mark has asked a really good question. Do you have any idea what the Kolbs thought about Cameron?
They were completely reliant on Cameron.
Bingo.
Yeah, completely reliant on Cameron. They gave him their first, the tent on his lawn. Then later the studio of course, started as the toll booth and then expanded, because of their symbiotic relationship. The Colts help take the tolls at time. They help tend the trails at time. The photos were essentially a surveillance and record keeping for Cameron and his money. And yeah, since the studio existed, it gets really confusing, but it's on the right of way of the trail, which gives it some legal protection, but it's also within the mining claim, which gives it some other weird legal protection.
Oh, interesting.
And then it's like associated with the mine and the trail, which gives it another level of weird protection. And so eventually the park just kind of like let them be there.
Yeah.
There were definitely plans for obviously the Kolb studio to be removed. But yeah, the Kolbs were reliant on them. And, I found correspondence between the Kolbs and the Camerons saying, like asking, hey, asking for advice, asking for, what do we do when the Park Service was wanting to do this and, all this stuff. And Cameron is always there for him too.
Interesting. And Dick Brown wants to know when the book on Cameron's coming out.
As soon as I get an agent.
All right. Good deal.
Yeah, I don't know. It's still working on it. There's more and more that I uncover every day. So it's like I don't feel like there can be the story is incomplete still.
Well, it's a bigger and better story than I've ever seen. So congratulations on pulling that together.
Thank you.
It's really cool. Any other questions this evening for Harris? And if there aren't, or while you're typing them in, this presentation tonight is brought to you by the Grand Canyon Historical Society. If you're not a member, you can go to grandcanyonhistory.org and do that right there on the website. We do all this because of membership and members who support what's happening here. So really appreciate that. Mark's asking another question here.
Yes, that was. In fact, I found research that suggests that.
Hey, Harris,
we're
we're just going to run through the question. So,
yeah.
Because we're recording this, and the question is, was the cave that the Kolbs used for developing at the top of the Bright Angel Trail considered to be one of Cameron's mines? That's the question.
Everything that I can point to says yes. Most things that I found point to the fact that it was a mine that was very public, so that people could see that Cameron was mining. And some evidence suggests that he had some Louisiana investors paying for that one. Because Cameron was always borrowing money from someone. He was always in debt, and he was always borrowing money.
Interesting. Huh.
But yeah, I mean, it's like the most visible potential site you can see. And it's like right at the head of the claim of the trail. So if you think about it, if you're trying to use mining claims as your validation for keeping control of property, you need a mine.
And the public goes right past it and says, oh, look, there's the mine. Yeah. Very clever. Very clever. Well, I want to thank you again so much, Harris, for giving this incredible presentation on Ralph Cameron. Please keep up the research. And this is really interesting. I'm going to ask you another question. So there was another potential dam, the Diamond Creek Dam, and that was an engineer out of Phoenix. The Diamond Creek Dam sort of forced Bridge Canyon Dam to be a little higher, to flood over the top of the Diamond Creek Dam. And so this was the feds fighting a private business, private company. So Cameron wasn't alone in this rush for dams.
No way. It was definitely a water rush, I would call it. The All-American Canal was, on its way or existing, depending on when the timeline you're talking about. So people had their eye on the river, both for power, for flood irrigation, or for flood control, and for irrigation and municipal consumption. So yeah, they were definitely not the only ones looking at the dam as a means to cash in.
Yeah. And you also mentioned the Swing Johnson bill, the enabling legislation for Hoover Dam, and that Cameron blocked that his last year in Congress. He blocked it for 2 years running. When he was gone, then the bill passed. And again, I look at this as a real fascinating bit of history of Arizona fighting California for water control. And so it sort of fits right into that. Really fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, with that, if there aren't any more questions, I'm going to turn the recording off, and we will open the floor up. I'm going to unmute everybody if you're willing, and we'll just visit for a couple 5 or 10 more minutes, and then we'll all go home. So with that, thank you, Harry.